Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the fifth dimension, where I'm continuing my podcast style series called The Best and Worst of Who, where I discuss, alongside a guest every episode, the best and the worst stories and parts of every era of Doctor Who. Last time I discussed the Hartnell era with Jamie, and today I have Bill on to discuss the Trouton era. How are you, Bill?
I'm okay, thanks, and thank you for having me on today to discuss the Patrick Troughton era.
No problem. So you may recognize Bill's voice, as he is also a co-host alongside me, Elliot, and Ryan in a podcast called Kavam, as well as voicing the Third Doctor in the Third Doctor Exile over on Dimension 5 Audio. So today we're going to be discussing the Troughton era. So I feel that this is one of the most highly regarded eras by fans, wouldn't you say, Bill?
Yeah, I would say so. I think Patrick Troughton overall as a Doctor is very well regarded by a lot of fans because I don't know. I think to many people he just represents kind of the Doctor at their best ultimately.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel he's really the template for the modern Doctor. He has a
Mm.
very like quirky, funny personality, very different from Hartnell. And I feel lots of the modern Doctors have kind of modeled their Doctor after him, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I would say that. Yeah, especially I would say like more recent Doctors such as Matt Smith, for instance, have taken a lot from Patrick Troughton's kind of
Hmm.
quirky, kind of impish nature and everything. And I think, yeah, it's for me, Second Doctor has always been one of my favorites as well. Because when I first got into the classics, he was one of the first Doctors that I watched,
Hmm.
and I just loved his era right from the get go, really. And it remains to this day one of my favorite eras of the show ever. Um, yeah.
Yeah, I feel it's one of those eras that barely really has any bad stories. Like some of the worst stories in his era that we're discussing. Just a bit of a disclaimer. We probably don't think there's lots of them are that bad. We probably
Mm.
just have to say them because, we've got to say some of the least favorite ones. It's lots of seasons of Classic Who don't really have a bad story, just the worst is still pretty good. So I definitely do agree. I feel this is definitely one of the most well received by fans, and lots of the more modern Doctors, even Sylvester McCoy, really, he's relatively modern,
Mm.
does definitely model lots of his character off of Troughton as well. So he's very much the modern templates. And so we might as well get into discussing the stories. So, Bill, why don't you start us off? Let's start on a positive note. What's a story that you really do like about this? What's a story that you like within this era? Not necessarily your favorite, just a really good story.
Um, well, for me, a lot of his last season, season six,
Mm.
is among there as just really great Doctor Who fundamentally,
Oh
and
yeah.
just a lot of, not all, but a lot of those stories from that season, I would rank very highly on my kind of list of favorite Doctor Who stories of all time. And yeah, I kind of love overall his kind of a lot of what happens in the Patrick Troughton era is it is Doctor Who probably its most formulaic,
Mm.
but I love that in a way because um, a lot of his stories are basically the same story fundamentally. Just what would now be seen as just a normal bog standard Doctor Who. Basically, really starts with Patrick Troughton's era. I think. I mean, you've kind of got it with Hartnell's a bit, but I think
Mm.
more so with Troughton because you've got a lot of the base under siege, sorry, um, stories, and that, like I say, has gone on to become such a fundamental part of Doctor Who itself, that a lot of stories, just like how I mentioned earlier about a lot of Doctors have been inspired by Patrick Troughton, a lot of later stories I think have been inspired by his stories. So to kind of say, I mean, off the top of my head, I think one that is not my favorite, but is still one that I would regard like really highly would probably be the invasion. I know, like, people say, oh, it's 8 parts and everything, and and normally when it comes, as a rule, when it comes to the longer length Doctor Who stories, they, people say, oh, they kind of get a bit repetitive after a while and a bit boring. But I think The Invasion is a good example of actually not being that, really. I think, yes, it is repetitive in some places, but it's never boring. It's very action packed. And it really, then obviously, of course, it was made as a template for the John Pertwee era, for the unit based stories and everything. And I think it's a really good introduction of that formula for the show, because it just does it so well. And it continues, obviously, it brings back Brigadier Lethbridge Stewart, who was, of course, started in the Web of Fear as a colonel. And the way he's brought back is really good. And his interaction with the second Doctor. I mean, I think his dynamic with the third Doctor is probably the best, but I still like his dynamic with the second a lot, because I just feel like Nicholas Courtney and Patrick Troughton really, I mean, they clearly got on very well together in real life. And just The Invasion overall is a really good Cyberman story, really good invasion story, basically. And just a cracking Doctor Who story overall. I mean, what would you kind of say for yours? What would you say, like, is a standout story for you?
Well, I originally had planned for my first mention to be The Invasion as well, mostly because,
okay.
I've watched this story twice, and I actually, about 20 minutes ago, recently finished rewatching the third episode. I'm watching it through yet again. So I feel it'd be a good mention. I really, really love The Invasion. Like you said, I feel it is repetitive, but that's fine because it's really good. Like what you were saying about the Base Under Siege stories, the fact that they're really all the same. I don't think that's a bad thing inherently, because like the formula is really good. Like, formulaic can be good if the formula is good. So I feel that's what works about the Patrick Troughton era. They found something that was good and they just stuck with it. Obviously, not for every episode, like the Mind Robber, some other stories don't really follow the formula, which is good. It's nice to have a bit of a diversion, but I feel it is quite safe watching a Base Under Siege story, because it's got to be quite good if it's very similar to all of the other really good ones, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I see what you mean, yeah.
Yeah, The Invasion, definitely. It does feel like a setup to the Pertwee era in a really, really good way. I absolutely love season 7 and 8. They're fantastic. Obviously, we'll get onto the Pertwee era in the next episode, but The Invasion, absolutely. You got I love how the Cybermen are only actually in the second half of the story. And at the time, because it didn't have Cybermen in the title, you would not have known at all that you wouldn't have known that the Cybermen would appear just because it's called The Invasion. It could be any alien until obviously the end of the 4th episode. I feel it's also worth a mention, the animation in this story. We've discussed animations quite a bit on Kavam. So what do you think about the animation for this story, Bill?
I think the animation is definitely, I mean, it was the very first missing episode one, wasn't it? And I think it's, I think a lot of what we've got later on and more recently has been really good. Not all of them, obviously, with the Web of Fear, for instance.
Yes.
The less said about that animation, the better. But with The Invasion, I feel like that animation really, I mean, again, it was a template for all the animations that would come later on. And it's just, I remember, I think, getting the Invasion DVD not too long after it came out. And, at the time, I don't think a lot of people knew, like, whether there was going to be more animations after that. Like, because obviously, it's been a much more common thing in the past 5-6 years, however long it's been now. But back then, in those early days, we didn't know if it was just going to be The Invasion or if it was going to become more of a regular thing. I mean, I'm glad that it's become a regular thing, because I think it's really helped to put a lot of missing stories I think it's helped fans to kind of reappraise them and to look at them a lot more positively. I think like the Macro Terror, for instance, I don't
Yes.
think originally was looked upon very highly, but I think now people just love it. I mean, I love it a lot. Yeah, I think it's the invasion animation is really, really good. I think it was done by the same people who did Scream for Schalke a few years beforehand,
Yes.
the Richard E. Grant story. And I loved Scream of the Schalke. So then to have that similar animation with the invasion, I just loved it even more because it was really nice to see again that kind of animation. It's a shame that I think the company's name was Cosgrove Hall. I think
Yes.
they're not around anymore, and that is a shame because I think if we'd have had more missing episode animations from them, that would have been like really, really good. And I do think it is a shame that they're sadly not with us anymore as a company. Um, but yeah, I love the invasion animation, and I think it just brings more to that story overall. And I think it really helps um, to do what missing episode animations do best, which is to bring to life these episodes which otherwise we wouldn't really know much about. We'd have, I mean, if it wasn't for these animations, all we'd really have for a lot of these episodes would be just the soundtrack and a few telesnaps or pictures, and that will be it. But I think it's really great that they've been going down this animation route, and I think they especially did a really good job in picking something like the invasion to start with, because I think that is a story which needs the animation treatment in order for people to really get the whole, like I said earlier, the whole action-packed nature of it as a story. I think you need something like animation to really bring that to life, and I'm really glad that we've got that animated. And yeah, I think it's just a really stellar and just well done animation.
Yeah, absolutely. All of that I definitely agreed with. I think the animation, it's not the best animation that's ever been done, but I
Mm,
feel for 2006, I feel that was really impressive considering it's like over 15 years ago it was done now. Like I would have been really quite small in 2006. Definitely, I wasn't Whovian at this time. So yeah, it's really great to see how well they did the animation for 2006. And another thing, it feels very much like a sort of template for the modern animations. Like they don't really look too different to obviously the later animations like Macra Terror, Faceless Ones, Evil of the Daleks. Do have the same sort of feel. Like they're not a completely different style like the the famous Web of Fear animation.
yeah.
But yeah, especially with the invasion, I feel, if they animated something like the Highlanders or the Space Pirates, it would have been fine. It'd be nice to have an animation, and I'm sure we will get animations of those. But
Mm,
I feel from like a marketing standpoint as well, obviously the invasion was a great choice. Also, it was only 2 episodes, so it did seem logical, and it's obviously one of the most trademark episodes of Patrick Troughton's era. Like maybe it's not the best, but it was
mm.
definitely an important one to animate because it's arguably one of the more iconic ones.
Yeah,
Yeah.
agreed. Yeah.
So now why don't we go onto a bit of a negative route, or maybe not so negative, just one of the less good stories of Patrick Troughton's era. Why don't you start us off, Bill?
Well, as soon as you said that, two stories which I know have not been very, have never been really very well regarded. Two immediately came to mind, which
Yep.
is the Dominators and the Crotons. Um, Personally, I mean, this might be somewhat controversial, I don't know, but I don't think they're as bad as people say. I
Hmm.
think a lot of what you were saying earlier about how, even with the worst ones, there's still something to like and enjoy. I think that's the case with these two. I think there's still something to like about these, but I completely get why people don't like them, because they're not like the Crotons is definitely not like the invasion, for instance. And the Dominators is nothing like the Invasion or the Mind Robber or
Mm.
any of the truly great Patrick Troughton stories. They're definitely a step down in terms of quality, but I think the Dominators especially has some really interesting ideas. Kind of, I think,
Yeah.
in a way, it's because it was made in the 60s, obviously. There's this whole thing of kind of, the I can't remember the their name, but the main inhabitants of the planets in the Dominators are very sort of like, they do not understand war at all, and they're very much like pacifists. And I think that is an interesting thing to be coming out when it did in the late 60s, because for those who know history anyway, at that time there was obviously Vietnam, and there was counterculture and everything. And so then to have that it's an interesting idea. I don't know if it necessarily works and it quite succeeds in what it's trying to get across, but I can kind of, I think it's a good attempt anyway, trying to kind of play into that kind of stuff that was going on in real life at the time this episode or story was made. And then the Crotons, I don't know what to say about the Crotons, because you'd think it being a Robert Holmes story, I mean, the very first Robert Holmes story, that it would be really great. And certainly that's the case with a lot of his later stories. And yet this one, the Crotons, is again not bad by any means, but it's just something about it, just it's not in the same vein as something like Spearhead from Space, or I'm trying to think of another one, like Terror of the Autons. Yeah, that's another good one. Yeah, it's not in the same league by any means with them lot. And it's a good enough story. Like, I can watch it and I can enjoy it for what it is, but I would always take something like The Invasion or The Mind Robber or The Seeds of Death or whatever over the Crotons, definitely. Yeah, I think I completely understand why most fans just do not like those two stories in particular, because I completely see what they're getting at with them being not very good. But I think there's still things to like about them both anyway. Yeah, I mean, what would you say is your kind of stories then?
Well, I did have two in mind, one of which was the Dominators. Which I did expect you to say the Dominators and something. But yeah, the Dominators, I don't mind the Dominators. Like, it's a bit meh. I think I'd give it like a 5.5 out of 10, maybe. It's meh. It doesn't, it's not good, it's not bad, it's just sort of in the middle for me. I don't really think there's any bad Troughton stories. Like, I can still enjoy parts of it, and it feels a bit formulaic of the Hartnell era, like a rebels versus rulers sort of battle, that sort of story. The kind of thing you get in Galaxy 4, the Savages, that sort, those sort of stories, the Daleks even. But yeah, I can understand why people really hate this one, and it doesn't really hold a candle to the rest of season 6, in my opinion. The Crotons, I've got to say, I do kind of like the Crotons. It's a pretty good story, I think. But yeah, I can definitely understand why people don't like it. I found out the other day, actually, the Crotons were meant to be replacements for the Daleks, which is interesting. So if you can imagine Genesis of the Crotons, Revolution of the Crotons, yeah, it'd be a bit different. So my other bad story, the one I also expected you to maybe say, was the Space Pirates. Yeah, quite possibly the most boring Doctor Who story I've ever seen. It's just, I cannot get into this story. I watched the first 2 episodes on, the fact that this is on Telesnaps really doesn't help. I watched the first 2 episodes on Telesnaps, and yeah, it's I sort of forgot about it because I was watching another story at the time. I completely forgot about it, and then at another point, I managed to sit myself all the way through it, and it's really dull, and it ends with such a cliche ending. The bomb on a timer. It feels very, very lackluster, and I find it very hard to believe that this was written by, was it Terrence Dicks? Was it?
No, it was Robert Holmes again, I
Oh,
think. Yeah.
really? Yeah, I knew it was either
Yeah.
Terrence Dicks or Robert Holmes. They're like the two best, probably. But yeah, I
Mm.
was very, very surprised when I saw the writers for the Dominators and no, sorry, the Crotons and the Space Pirates, that they were both Robert Holmes. I thought, is this like a printing error or something? Because these aren't Robert Holmes stories. It's a bit strange. But then again, he got really good in the Pertwee era.
Mm.
So before we say our like number one least favorites and favorite each, then we might as well take it a bit more positive route. And I thought I'd mention another really good story that we've recently had an animation for, that being Evil of the Daleks.
Yes.
It's a really fantastic one. I feel it's just a very epic end to the Daleks. Like, if they never showed up again after this, obviously we do have some great Dalek stories later on, like Genesis, Remembrance, Dalek as in series 1 episode 6 Dalek, Revolution. We've got some great ones, but I feel that this is such a satisfying conclusion to the Daleks that I wouldn't mind as much if they'd never shown up after this. I mean, it would have certainly been not as good as if there were Crotons instead, but the Daleks Evil of the Daleks is fantastic. The animation is really, really brilliant. Obviously, I've discussed this previously on the channel a few times. It's a really fantastic animation and story. What would you say, Bill?
Yep, I completely agree with you. With Evil being so good, because it just is so good. I think it's always been a story that's been very well regarded, even when we had just the reconstructions to go off. Because I remember people always saying that, like to name another one, Power of the Daleks and Evil of the Daleks, both two really great Dalek stories. Both, thankfully, have now been animated. And yeah, I completely agree with you in Evil being really good, because, like I say, it is just so. I mean, yes, it's 7 episodes, and again, like I said earlier, it's a longer story, so obviously it does get a bit boring in parts, or a bit kind of like repetitive at the very least. But I think there's definitely you could have trimmed a lot of what happens between Jamie and I think is it Kemmel? You could have trimmed a lot of that, because I think there's at least 2 episodes devoted to that. I think you could have easily trimmed that down a lot, because it doesn't need to be as long as it was. But besides that, Evil of the Daleks is just a really, really great Doctor Who story. And you've got some really great performances from the cast.
Oh yeah,
Patrick Troughton especially is just, I don't know. I think he knows how the Doctor would react to the Daleks like really well. I think he completely gets it.
Oh yeah, I feel at this point he was really sort of invested in the character, even after like how many episodes? Like 7 episodes, I believe. Sort of stories. He feels so ingrained with the character now. He just sort of understands it.
Yeah.
It's a really brilliant story. I feel if there's one thing that the Trouton era does really well, besides companions, it's probably the fact that lots of the stories are really long stories, that they somehow manage to not feel really dragged out. Some of them, do obviously have their moments, like this story with Jamie and Kemmel, but I still liked those episodes. Sure, they weren't as good as the rest, but I feel that this era is, very skilled at not making things feel really dragged out.
Yeah, I completely agree, because like you say, there's a lot of longer episodes in a lot of these stories, which, according to longer episodes rules, should be really, dull and boring and really difficult to get through. But I don't know, there's just in general, like I say, the Patrick Troughton era is just really good because it's just the way it just sticks with, not always, but most of the time with the base under siege stories. It just sticks with that formula, and it doesn't need to really change it that much because you get some really good stories out of it. And there's just so many. I mean, we could be here all day just naming how many I can think of just off the top of my head. But there's ones like The Abominable Snowman, which obviously is going to be animated very soon, which I don't think is as good as The Web of Fear, but is still really solid Doctor Who story. The Macro Terror is really, really good. Power and Evil of the Daleks, like we've said earlier, is really, really good. It's just so many stories, and a lot of them, like you say, are 6-parters or 7-parters or however long they may be. They shouldn't be as good as they are, but they are.
Like on paper, lots of these stories don't really sound very good. Another story, which is a very long story, I'll get onto that a bit later, which I won't name for spoiler purposes, but it doesn't sound very good on paper. Like this many episodes with just this one concept, it shouldn't work, but it does. A weird analogy I heard the other day about the Trouton era was someone comparing them to Marvel films, as in they're very formulaic and lots of them are really the same, but people love them because the formula's so good. They know what people like and they just stick with it, and it kind of works. I do feel it's a bit of a shame how many people at the time tuned out during Patrick Troughton's era. Like if you look at viewing figures for 1965, 1966, they were really high. Like it wasn't uncommon for an episode to go above 10 million on broadcast. But looking at the end, there were a few episodes of the War Games that got below 4 million. So it really did drop, which I think is a shame. I can kind of understand if watching a base under siege story all at once, or maybe just over the course of a day or two, doesn't seem as bad. But if it's over the course of several months and that's all Doctor Who you had, I do sort of understand. But now, if we get a bit bored of Base Under Siege, we can just switch to another era, So now we've done a bit of a discussion of the good and maybe not so good of the Patrick Troughton era. We might as well move on to our number one favorite and least favorite of the Troughton era. So you might have already said this, Bill, I don't know, but would you like to say your least favorite of the Troughton era?
I have not yet said this, no. Now my least favorite is something which I know you said earlier about how most Patrick Troughton stories you can still get something out of them when you watch them. This, for me, this story, which is the Underwater Menace.
Oh, yeah.
is something which, yes, I can laugh at because of how tremendously ridiculous it is. But I don't know. I'm laughing at it, sure, but I'm not necessarily enjoying it. I'm just thinking, what on earth are they doing? I'm just thinking, what on earth am I watching here? The fish people supposedly swimming about, for instance, the way that's executed, it just doesn't quite work. I know, obviously, this was done on a really tight 60s TV budget, so obviously they're going to be very limited in what they can do. But even so, just watching it, I just think, and then the music as well. The scene that sticks in my mind, like I say, is the bit with the fish people swimming about and everything. And the music is just, it sticks in my head, but it sticks in my head for all the wrong reasons, if you see what I mean. It's just not any good for me. And Professor Zaroff is such a bizarre villain for Doctor Who, really.
Oh, yeah.
He's so hammy and camp, and I mean, I have got to laugh when he does his whole nothing in the world can stop me now sort of
Oh yeah.
thing. I mean, that is really funny, but I know I suppose I don't know. Would you say it's kind of like it's supposed to be funny, or would you say it's unintentionally funny? Because I don't know. I can't decide which one it is.
Yeah, what you were saying about the Underwater Menace. I can't really say too much of a judgment because I actually
Mm,
haven't seen all of this story. I've only seen the first two episodes, and even from that, yeah, it was pretty ridiculous. I feel it didn't really intend to be funny, but maybe sort of the people producing this sort of knew this isn't going to be, people aren't going to take this seriously because of how low a budget we've got. We can't really
mm.
fix anything, so we might as well add a bit of extra comedic value to it, maybe something along
Yeah.
those lines. It's definitely an interesting story. When I was saying the ones I didn't really like, that one didn't really come to mind.
Mm.
But yeah, that one, from what I've seen of it, I probably give around a five-ish, similar to the Dominators. Yeah, it's not the best. I do need to give this one a watch at some point to make some more acute judgments about it. But yeah, it's not the best. So for my least favorite, we have actually already mentioned this. I'm going to say the Space Pirates.
Mm.
It's
Yeah, I had a feeling you would. Yeah.
yeah, it's really boring. It is so dull. It's 6 episodes as well.
Mm.
And I feel for some of the animations, I feel while it's good to have all like to replicate the entire episode perfectly, I feel for some stories maybe it would be better to sort of trim it down, remove all the filler and just cut it down to like a feature length 90 or 100-minute film, perhaps. I
Maybe.
feel
Yeah.
for some stories, maybe like Marco Polo, if they ever do it to save on
Mm.
money, because obviously it's a very big story, as well as this, it might be better doing that because they don't need to replicate it perfectly in some cases. Just get the
Mm.
point across more than anything. So I feel Space Pirates would really benefit from that. But yeah, it's a really dull story. The villain is really stupid. Much like the Underwater Menace, the villain is ridiculous.
Mm.
I feel if there's one downfall of this era, it's that the villains, the human villains, aren't very memorable. Like it's either a
Yeah.
really bad villain or just a generic base leader. Um, so yeah, they aren't the best. And like I said, it ends on a really generic cliche way with a ticking bomb. It feels very stupid and camp.
Yeah.
I don't really like this one at all. I'd probably give it like a 4 maybe.
Mm.
Yeah, it's not good. um
If I could just say quickly, I think
yeah.
like I get why people don't like Space Pirates and what you're saying about how boring it is. I get that completely, and I think watching it as like with the telesnaps and everything, I I think it's like the invasion, like I said earlier, with the invasion being so action packed. I think again the Space Pirates is kind of trying to do a similar thing. It's trying to have so much going on, and
Hmm.
I think um, when it comes to being animated, if it ever is, I mean, it probably will be, but
Yeah.
not for quite a while. Maybe I mean, I can imagine this being, if not the last Patrick Troughton story to be animated, then
Hmm.
certainly the penultimate anyway. Um, because there's not much commercial value, let's be honest, in it, besides it being the penultimate Patrick Troughton story. Um, I think for me, I've had a more positive experience of it, but that's because um, when I was, like I say, when I was a lot younger, I experienced it as an audio CD, and I think so. Experience it that way um, made me like it more than I think other people do, like yourself and everything,
Hmm.
because I didn't have to like try and watch still images of spaceships floating about in space, which let's be honest, it's just not the right, not really, it's not really the best way to watch that kind of scene because um, it just doesn't do it any service, and it's a shame that we've only got one episode surviving of it because I think the model work of it is something which is really good. The what little we have of the space shots of like when I think when the pirates are in the spacesuits and they're setting the charges on the beacons or whatever it is, and then you've got the spaceships themselves flying through space and everything. I think that looks pretty good actually.
Oh yeah.
So the model work is fine, but yeah, I think it's just something which until it's animated, I don't think people are gonna really ever like it, because I think it's just something which it's a story that it just doesn't, it's not designed to be watched in still images. And I think the good thing of why I appreciate it more more positively is because, like I say, I got to experience it first through the audio CD, which I think is a lot better, because then you can imagine all the action that's going on in your head, which I think helps to bring it to life a lot more. But yeah, I do completely understand why it is so not well regarded, because yeah, it is trying, I think it is trying to, like I say, replicate what worked really well with other stories like The Invasion. But I think for whatever reason, it just didn't work in the same way in this instance. And yeah, it's, again, like you said earlier, it's really surprising that someone like Robert Holmes wrote this story. The same with the Crotons, because you wouldn't think that it was his story at all. You would think that it was just some writer that they just got in last minute, or who wasn't very well experienced or what have you. And yet it is actually a Robert Holmes story. It's a very strange, bizarre thing. But yeah, I think it's completely fair enough for you to have it as your absolute least favorite of this era, because I completely get why. As much as I have had a more positive experience of it, I completely understand your reasons why and everything. And yeah, I completely get it. Yeah.
Nice. So, yeah, what you were saying about it being on an audio CD, I can sort of understand that, because, like, one of the main reasons why loads of people love Big Finish is because it can do a lot more on a really, not very big budget, much lower than the budget of the actual program, because you just need your imagination, for the imagery. It can just be as high budget as you want in your head. It's got a lot more freedom. That's why I chose to do an audio series, because doing an animated one would have been a very time consuming thing. So yeah, that brings us on to our favorites. And Bill, which would you say your favorite of the Trouton era is?
I don't think this is going to surprise you too much, but it is, well, I kind of switch between two, actually. I think at this moment in time, the one I would go with is the War Games.
Yeah.
But the other one would be The Enemy of the World.
Yes.
And
those are the two I predicted.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
The War Games, because, like, I think it is the one that you alluded to earlier, isn't it? Of like, you would think it being as long as it is, 10 episodes, would make it really difficult to get through. And yet it isn't. It's like, I'm pretty sure Terrence Dicks himself once said in an interview or Derek Sherwin or someone said, it's actually quite a good idea for story in some ways, because even though it's 10 episodes, it's, how many wars have we had? It's like a bit of string. You can just keep on pulling on it. And I think that's what works so well about it, is you can just go essentially to these different time zones, different periods in history, and you can tell like an overarching story really well in it. And especially when it's 10 episodes, because you've got the space to kind of split it up into different zones. Like I think they start off in World War One, and then they switch to
Civil War.
Yeah, American Civil War, and then they touch on like the Romans and other bits of history like that.
Yeah.
And I think that it really works to its strength. And also another reason why I love it so much is because of the ending.
Oh yeah.
Not just the Doctor regenerating and being exiled to Earth. I mean, that is great in itself, but also him having to say goodbye to Jamie and Zoe. Every time I watch that, I always feel really upset by it because, and I do well up a bit with tears because, like I say, when I first got into the classics, the second Doctor was one of the very first classic Doctors I ever watched. And I especially remember watching fairly early on. This was before, obviously, a lot of his stuff was later animated and everything. A lot of his a lot of the only stories that you could watch from his era was season 6 stuff with Jamie and Zoe. So I grew up with like the Mind Robber, the Invasion, the Seeds of Death, and everything. So when you get to see those three saying goodbye to each other at the end of the War Games, it has a real emotional impact on me because it's like a TARDIS team that I kind of, even though all those episodes were made long before I was even born, it's kind of a TARDIS team which I've in a way kind of grown up with. And so I just think the way that those three regulars just handle that scene is just so moving and just so powerful because you can tell they really don't want to say goodbye to each other, but they've got no choice. Like the Doctor wants to keep on traveling with Jamie and Zoe, but he's got to say goodbye to them because he's got to be exiled to Earth and everything to pay for his crimes of interfering in other planets and everything. And yeah, it's just a really moving scene. And I think it is, I'll be honest, I think it is one of the best last stories for any Doctor, really, because I think the way in which Patrick Troughton goes out is just, he's like, I know it's kind of the regeneration itself, we don't properly get it in a way. We never get to see him properly merge into John Pertwee, but just the way his last few minutes are written and everything is just really powerful. And just, when it's a perfect example ultimately as a story of if you're going to do a last story for any Doctor, but especially like the second Doctor, a very well regarded Doctor, you want to do it right. And I think that the War Games, it just does it right. It knows what it's doing. It's really, again, it's another action-packed story, and but unlike the Space Pirates, it works. It works really, really well. And even though it's 10 episodes, so I think it's at least 4 hours long or so.
Yeah.
So it is something that you've got to truly commit to watching because there's so much going on. But I don't mind that because I can just completely get into it and just have a really enjoyable ride with it from start to finish. And yeah, that is why at this moment in time anyway, it is my number one favorite Patrick Troughton story, and possibly I think probably my favorite Doctor Who story ever, because I just have such a enjoyable experience with it. The Enemy of the World, again, it knows what it's doing.
Yeah.
And it is a spy thriller, and it's a spy thriller in an era of Doctor Who where you don't really get that normally. But I think it works really well because Salamander is actually one of the few human villains of this era that actually stands out really well and actually works really well, because even though like the basic premise of him is kind of a bit, cliche in a way, of him just being a doppelganger of the second Doctor, it still works really well because Patrick Troughton just gives such a memorable performance as Salamander, and yet he's also able to give a pretty good performance as the Doctor himself, and also just all the intrigue and sort of politics and everything that goes on in the Enemy of the World is just really fascinating and interesting, and just yeah, it's another story that I just love from start to finish, and I just really enjoy watching. So yeah, and like I say, normally, sometimes it is my favorite as well, or instead of the war game. Sorry, at this moment in time, I would say it's just in second place, but only just. And I think what tips it, what tips the whole thing in the war games' favor is the last few minutes ultimately of it, because that's just like I say, really, it just really impacts me, and it makes a massive impact. Sorry, and yeah, it's just really powerful stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, pretty much everything you just said, I
Mm.
absolutely agree with. The War Games is my favorite Doctor Who story ever. It's absolutely fantastic. I do agree. Episode 10 is probably the best 25 minutes of Doctor Who I've ever watched. It's
Mm.
absolutely fantastic. I think Enemy of the World, yeah, is also a really, really strong one. Probably like in my top five, I'd say, ever. I
Mm.
feel my top five is probably go something like War Games, um, probably Frontier in Space, Seeds of Doom, Genesis of the Daleks, and then Enemy of the World. But yeah, War Games is absolutely fantastic. I feel it just shows how good a writer Terrence Dicks is, that, you know, it's 4 hours long. And I did not get bored in this story. Like,
Mm.
there was like, I didn't get bored per se, but there was a tiny, tiny lull in like episode 4 with Jamie and the Civil War guys. But
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
really, it was nothing. It was basically the tiniest hiccup. Like, nothing's perfect, but the War
Mm.
Games is about as close to perfect as you can get when it comes to Doctor Who. It's absolutely fantastic. Yeah, and Enemy of the World again. It's Salamander. It's fantastic. I've got him as my profile picture on Discord. I Yeah, he's probably my favorite human villain. Besides, I was going to say besides the Master. The Master's my favorite humanoid villain, but yeah, my
Mm.
favorite human villain is probably Salamander. Yeah, this is a really fantastic story. Um, one tiny pet peeve I do have with Enemy of the World is the fact that it's set in 2018 and really contradicts any other story set around that time in New Who.
Yeah.
Um, so it's set around the time of the woman who lived, and that didn't really look like the story. But yeah, I
Mm.
understand why, obviously, because it was made in the 1960s. But yeah, War Games, the ending is probably one of the saddest moments in all of Doctor Who. Like, it's up there with some of the regenerations for me. It's awful to watch.
Mm.
Although a really, really well directed episode. So yeah, that rounds off this episode of the best and worst of Who with the Trouton era. Thank you very much, Bill, for doing this. It has been a pleasure to talk to you about the Trouton era.
No problem. And I just want to say thank you again for having me on for this. And yeah, it's been a real pleasure as well to talk to you about the Troughton era, and to find out that we have a lot of stuff in common when it comes to favorites and least favorites, and just yeah. And yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, no problem. So I thought I'd just say a few honorable mentions of stories that I feel deserve recognition, but we didn't really have time to cover. Fury from the Deep, Power
Mm.
of the Daleks, Moonbase, Macra Terror, and Mind Robber. Yeah, they're
Yeah.
5 really, really good ones as well that we didn't quite have time to talk about, but I'm sure will be, discussed at a later point, whether it be Kavam or my channel. So yeah,
Yeah.
thank you everyone for watching, and I will be back in another few weeks with the Pertwee era. So thanks for watching, and goodbye.